Why Germany's best tank crews were terrified of this American airplane. In 1944, the most feared weapon on the Normandy battlefield was not a tank. It was not an artillery piece. It was not a rifle or a mortar or a flamethrower. It was a sound. A whistling sound that descended from clear sky, followed by the rapid hammer of 8 machine guns firing simultaneously. By the time a German tanker heard it, he had perhaps 2 seconds to abandon his vehicle. 2 seconds to throw open his hatch, jump from the turret, and run for ditch, because the alternative was to be trapped inside a steel box while 8.50 caliber rounds per second tore through everything he had. The Germans called these aircraft Jabos, short for Jagdbomber, fighter bomber. And when the Jabos appeared overhead, veteran soldiers who had fought in Poland, in France, in the burning streets of Stalingrad, men who had faced every terror that modern war could produce, these men ran. They ran and they hid and they prayed for clouds. Because there was no other answer. Major Hans von Luck commanded Panzer Grenadier Regiment 125 of the 21st Panzer Division on August 17, 1944, near the village of Trun in Normandy. He was 33 years old. He had fought in 5 campaigns across 3 continents. He commanded Panthers, the most capable medium tank in the German arsenal, with sloped armor that deflected most Allied shells and a 75mm gun that could destroy a Sherman at 2,000 meters. None of that mattered when the Jabos came. This is the story of how an American airplane changed the nature of warfare forever, and what it felt like to be on the receiving end of the most complete air superiority in the history of land combat. To understand what German tank crews were facing in Normandy, you need to understand the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, and the word Thunderbolt is not metaphorical. It was a massive single-engine fighter aircraft, the heaviest single-engine fighter in the war by a significant margin. Fully loaded with fuel, ammunition, and ordnance, it weighed 17,500 pounds, approximately 8 tons. 8 tons of aluminum, steel, and firepower, driven through the sky by a Pratt Whitney R2800 double wasp radial engine. 18 cylinders, air-cooled, producing 2,000 horsepower, turning a 4-bladed Curtiss electric constant-speed propeller 13 feet in diameter. When the engine was running, you could hear it from a mile away. When it was diving, you could hear it from 2 miles. The primary armament was 8 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns, mounted in each wing. Each gun was loaded with between 300 and 425 rounds. When all 8 fired simultaneously, which they did, the pilot pressing a single trigger, the Thunderbolt could deliver a weight of fire exceeding 100 pounds per second. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds would penetrate light armor, ignite fuel tanks, and tear through soft-skinned vehicles as if the steel and canvas were paper. Beyond the guns, the P-47 carried external ordnance on hardpoints under the fuselage and wings. A centerline rack could carry a 500-pound bomb. Wing racks could bring the total bomb load to 2,500 pounds. Alternatively, the aircraft could be armed with 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, HVARs, each carrying a 7.6-pound TNT warhead effective against vehicles, buildings, and anything alive in the open. Then there was the characteristic that German soldiers noticed most acutely. The Thunderbolt was almost impossible to shoot down. The radial engine, unlike the liquid-cooled inline engines used by German fighters, could lose several cylinders to battle damage and continue operating. Lose a cylinder on a liquid-cooled engine and the cooling fluid bleeds out, the engine seizes, and the aircraft goes down. Lose a cylinder on a radial and it just runs a little rougher. The airframe was built with heavy structural members and thick aluminum skin. Armor plating protected the pilot from the front and rear. The self-sealing fuel tanks closed automatically around bullet holes to prevent catastrophic fuel loss. P-47 pilots routinely returned to base with extensive damage. Holes through wings and fuselage, entire cylinders blown off the engine. Control surfaces partially shot away. The aircraft earned a single reputation among the men who flew it: the machine most likely to bring you home alive. German anti-aircraft gunners learned this firsthand. You could hit a Thunderbolt and watch it absorb the rounds and keep diving. You could see pieces come off it and keep firing and watch it complete its attack run anyway. The psychology of that, of shooting at something that keeps coming, was deeply unsettling to men who depended on their ability to destroy threats before those threats destroyed them. By the summer of 1944, the Jabos had been hunting German soldiers for months. They were very good at it. The word air superiority appears in military histories with such frequency that it begins to lose its meaning. A phrase in an analyst's report. A box checked in a campaign summary. What it actually meant, in Normandy in the summer of 1944, was this: German soldiers could not move during daylight. Not safely. Not anywhere within roughly 100 kilometers of the front lines. Official Luftwaffe intelligence reports from early July 1944 documented that Allied fighter bombers were conducting between 2,000 and 3,000 sorties per day over the Normandy battlefield. German formations attempting to move to the front during daylight hours were losing 10 to 15% of their vehicles before reaching their designated assembly areas. Tank columns reported being attacked every 20 to 30 minutes when weather permitted operations. Consider what that means for armored warfare. The entire German tactical doctrine, Blitzkrieg, the operational approach that had conquered Poland in 5 weeks and France in 6, was built on mobility. Fast-moving armored columns that could penetrate enemy lines, exploit breakthroughs, and strike rear areas before defenders could react. Speed was not merely an advantage in German doctrine. It was the doctrine. Take away the ability to move and you had taken away the German army's fundamental source of combat power. Allied aircraft took it away. German armored divisions that should have been able to cover 50 to 80 kilometers per day were reduced to moving only at night. Covering perhaps 20 kilometers before dawn forced them back into concealment. Units dispersed into small groups and hid in woods or villages during daylight hours. Camouflage netting became more important than ammunition stocks. Commanders planned movements around weather forecasts, praying for clouds and rain that would ground Allied aircraft. The psychological impact on German soldiers went deeper than the physical damage. The term they coined for this new reality was Jabo, death by fighter bomber. It became, according to German veterans, the most feared way to die in the entire campaign. Not in tank versus tank combat, where training and skill provided some agency. Not in an infantry assault, where individual courage could make a difference. But on a road, in a steel vehicle, strafed repeatedly, unable to fight back effectively, watching comrades burn inside machines that had become mobile crematoriums. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, perhaps Germany's most respected military commander, the man whose tactical brilliance in North Africa had earned him the nickname the Desert Fox even from his enemies, understood this problem with perfect clarity from the campaign's earliest days. On June 10, 1944, just 4 days after D-Day, he sent a frank assessment to the Wehrmacht High Command. The enemy's air superiority has a very grave effect on our movements. There's simply no answer to it. Every movement of our troops by day is subject to air attack from fighter bombers. The enemy has complete command of the air over the battle area up to about 100 kilometers behind the front. Rommel was not expressing pessimism. He was producing accurate tactical analysis from the most experienced field commander in the German army. He had fought against Allied air power in North Africa. He understood precisely what it meant for ground operations to lose the sky. 5 weeks later, on July 17, 1944, Rommel became a casualty of the very air power he had been warning about. He was returning from an inspection tour of the front lines when his staff car was spotted by British Spitfires from 602 Squadron, Royal Air Force. The Spitfires dived and strafed the vehicle on a road near St. Foy de Montgomery. Machine gun fire struck the car and the road surface. The driver lost control. The vehicle crashed. Rommel, who was not wearing a seatbelt, was thrown from the car onto the road surface. 3 skull fractures. A fractured left temple and cheekbone. Damage to his left eye. Allied air power had removed Germany's most capable field commander from the Normandy battlefield. He never returned. And Rommel was not alone. Between June 6 and June 18, 1944, just 12 days, 3 German division commanders were killed in air attacks. General Erich Marx, commander of the 84th Corps and one of the most experienced defensive specialists in the Wehrmacht, was killed by a fighter bomber attack on June 12. General Heinz Helmy, commanding the 243rd Infantry Division, died in an air attack on June 17, as his division moved toward the front. General Rudolf Stegmann, commanding the 77th Infantry Division, was killed by strafing aircraft on June 18. 3 division commanders in 12 days. Death at the hands of Allied fighter bombers had become so indiscriminate that it consumed generals and private soldiers with equal appetite. Rank provided no protection from 8.50 caliber machine guns firing from a diving Thunderbolt. None. Hans von Lach's 21st Panzer Division held a unique distinction in the history of the Normandy campaign. It was the only German armoured unit to reach the invasion beaches on June 6, 1944, launching a counterattack against British forces advancing from Sword Beach toward Cannes. On the longest day of the war, von Lach's men had come closest to throwing the Allied invasion back into the sea. That was 2.5 months before August 17, 1944. Since that first day, the division had been in continuous combat, and the attrition had been relentless. The 21st Panzer had fought at Villers-Bocage, where Tiger Tank commander Michael Whitman had briefly halted a British armoured column with a single bold charge. It had defended against Operation Goodwood in July, the massive British armoured offensive preceded by the heaviest aerial bombardment of the Normandy campaign, when hundreds of heavy bombers dropped thousands of tons of ordnance on German defensive positions before 1,100 tanks rolled forward. Even that had been held, through the combination of terrain, prepared defenses, and a determination that impressed even the British commanders who faced it. But successful defensive battles take their toll the same as defeats. By early August 1944, the 21st Panzer Division had lost most of its original equipment. What remained was an improvised mixture of surviving German tanks, captured French armoured vehicles, and field modifications created by the division's gifted engineer, Major Alfred Becker. Becker had converted obsolete French tanks and chassis into functional fighting vehicles, assault guns, armoured personnel carriers, hybrid machines that combined German weapons with French hulls and running gear. The division soldiers called their collection Rummel Circus. Some units operated Panther tanks alongside French Hotchkiss light tanks mounting German guns. Infantry rode in a mixture of German half-tracks and converted French vehicles. The division's maintenance crews performed genuine miracles of improvised engineering, keeping this diverse fleet operational under combat conditions with limited spare parts, no reliable supply chain, and the constant threat of air attack preventing any daylight resupply operations. By mid-August, von Luck commanded approximately 40 tanks and assault guns, along with the 2 infantry battalions of his 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment. The division that had been one of the Wehrmacht's most powerful armoured formations in June had been ground down by 2.5 months of unrelenting combat to something that barely resembled its original strength. And now it had been assigned the most critical mission of the entire campaign. Because the trap was closing. The decision that created the Falaise disaster began in Hitler's headquarters. American forces under Lieutenant General George Patton had broken through German defenses at Avranches at the end of July 1944 and were racing east and north in a sweeping operational maneuver that threatened to encircle the entire German force in Normandy. British and Canadian forces were pushing south from Caen. The trap was closing around 5 German divisions. German field commanders, Rommel, before his injury, and others after, had recognized the danger and requested permission to withdraw. Encirclement meant annihilation. The mathematics were simple and terrible. If the gap between American forces coming from the south and Allied forces closing from the north was allowed to close, 100,000 German soldiers would be trapped with no supply, no air cover, and no direction to retreat. Adolf Hitler refused to permit withdrawal. Instead, he ordered an immediate counterattack, Operation Luttich, an armoured thrust toward Avranches designed to cut off Patton's supply lines and restore the German defensive front. 4 Panzer divisions would drive west, sever the American corridor, and recapture the initiative. The counterattack was launched on August 7, 1944. It failed within 48 hours. The primary reason for the failure was not superior American tactics or overwhelming ground force. It was the weather. On August 8, after several days of clouds and rain that had grounded most Allied air operations, the sky over Normandy cleared. Allied commanders immediately launched every available aircraft. Over 3,000 sorties were flown that single day. P-47 Thunderbolts and British Typhoons fell on German armoured columns attempting to advance toward Avranches, then on the same columns trying to withdraw from the failed attack. The attacks were coordinated through a system that represented one of the most significant tactical innovations of the war. Forward air controllers with advancing ground forces, equipped with radios, could identify German targets and transmit coordinates to aircraft circling overhead within minutes. Fighter bombers dove on German positions, expended their ammunition and bombs, returned to forward airfields in Normandy, some established within days of D-Day, to rearm and refuel, then return to strike again. Some pilots flew 4 or 5 missions in a single day. The devastation was extraordinary. 2nd Panzer Division, one of the elite German armoured formations, lost over 70% of its tanks and vehicles in 48 hours. The division effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Survivors described roads littered with burning vehicles, dead horses, and the dead themselves. The division commander reported that his unit had been destroyed not by American ground forces, but by unrelenting air attacks that made movement impossible and concentration suicidal. The failed counterattack created the conditions for the Falaise pocket. Canadian forces pushing south from Caen and American forces sweeping north from the Avranches breakout were now converging on the town of Falaise, threatening to encircle everything. 5 German divisions, hundreds of thousands of men. German commanders began a fighting withdrawal, attempting to escape eastward through a narrowing gap before the trap closed completely. But the withdrawal had to be conducted largely during daylight hours, because the situation was deteriorating too rapidly to wait for darkness. German units moved in daylight, and paid a terrible price. The road east from Trun toward Vermoutiers was described by Allied pilots as a shooting gallery, a single road clogged with vehicles, horses, artillery pieces, supply wagons, and men, all moving in the same direction under clear skies. Pilots who flew over the Falaise corridor in those days described the scene below as something from a previous century. Column after column of horse-drawn artillery and supply wagons interspersed with modern tanks and trucks, everything moving east, everything burning. Into this destruction, von Luck's battle group held its position on the low ridges west of Trun, fighting to keep the western end of the corridor open. The experience of being attacked by fighter bombers was described by von Luck and every other German veteran who wrote about Normandy as unlike any other form of combat they had encountered. In tank versus tank engagement, a crew could see the enemy at distance. They could read the terrain. They could maneuver to a hull-down position behind a ridge, use a tree line as cover, call for support from infantry or artillery. There was agency. There was the possibility of fighting back effectively. Artillery was terrifying, but it provided some warning. You could hear the guns fire, estimate the direction, dig in and wait. You could construct overhead cover. You could reduce the effective casualty radius through discipline and preparation. Fighter bombers gave almost no warning. The first indication was often the sound of diving engines, followed seconds later by the hammer of machine guns or the explosion of rockets and bombs. By the time a German tanker heard the descending whistle of an attacking Thunderbolt and recognized it for what it was, the aircraft was already in its attack run, perhaps 1,000 feet away, diving at 400 miles per hour, its 8 guns already lined up on the vehicle below. 2 seconds. 3 if the pilot was approaching from slightly off angle. German anti-aircraft defenses in Normandy by August 1944 had been drastically reduced. A few self-propelled flak guns, some improvised mounts on vehicle chassis, these had deterrent value, forcing Allied pilots to attack from higher altitudes or approach from unexpected directions. But the deterrence was incomplete. Allied pilots learned to identify anti-aircraft positions and strike them first, then attack the vehicles they were protecting. The sequence became routine. Dive on the flak gun, silence it, circle back and attack the armored column it had been defending. The psychological strain accumulated faster than the physical damage. German soldiers who had demonstrated extraordinary courage in ground combat for years found themselves helpless against an enemy they could barely see and could not effectively engage. Clear weather, which soldiers have welcomed since the beginning of warfare because it permits observation and makes footing reliable, became a source of dread. Units began moving in very small groups, dispersing widely to reduce the value of any single attack. Others tried to move during twilight, the brief windows after dawn and before dusk when there was enough light to navigate, but Allied air operations were reduced. The fundamental reality, though, remained unchanged by any tactical adaptation. As long as Allied aircraft controlled the sky, German ground forces were vulnerable wherever they moved and to whatever extent they concentrated. Von Luck's men held their positions through August 17th, fighting off probing attacks by Canadian forces while watching the sky nervously. The weather was clear. Aircraft were overhead almost continuously. German vehicles attempting to move through the corridor were attacked repeatedly. Von Luck later wrote in his memoir that those final days, from August 17th to August 21st, when the corridor finally closed, were among the most difficult of his military career. Not because of the ground fighting, though that was intense, because of what came from above. His men held their positions and allowed thousands of German soldiers to escape eastward before the gap closed. By the time von Luck's battle group finally withdrew, most of his tanks and assault guns had been destroyed by air attacks. His infantry had suffered severe casualties. And the experience of those 5 days under constant threat from above had demonstrated, beyond any possibility of intellectual dispute, that armored forces operating without air cover could not survive on a modern battlefield. Approximately 50,000 German soldiers were trapped in the Falaise pocket when it finally closed on August 21st. Roughly half managed to escape through the corridor that von Luck and units like his had held open. The other half, approximately 25,000 men, were killed or captured. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, who had replaced Rommel as commander of German forces in the west after Rommel's wounding, described the Falaise battle as the greatest defeat in the history of German arms since Stalingrad. He was not wrong. While German tank crews were learning these lessons in the fields below, the men flying the P-47s were accumulating their own education, in a different vocabulary, at a different cost. Second Lieutenant Quentin Aanenson came from Leuven, Minnesota, a small farming community near the South Dakota border where the horizon stretched flat to every direction and the sky seemed larger than it did anywhere else. He had been commissioned as a second lieutenant on January 7, 1944. After completing flight training, he arrived in England in May and was assigned to the 391st Fighter Squadron of the 366th Fighter Group, one of the 9th Air Force's tactical fighter groups assigned to support the invasion of France. His first combat mission was June 6, 1944. D-Day. He took off from Thruxton Airfield in England, flew his P-47 across the English Channel, and drop his bombs on German positions behind Point du Hoc in advance of the American forces landing on Omaha and Utah beaches below. He was flying combat on the most important day in the history of the war, on the day the outcome of Western civilization was being decided in the water below him, and he was 23 years old. 10 days later, on June 16th, his squadron relocated from England to a hastily constructed airfield in Normandy. PSP runways of pierced steel planking laid on French soil while the campaign was still in its opening phase. From that forward base, Aanenson and his squadron flew bombing and strafing missions almost daily. German troops, German vehicles, German artillery positions, German supply dumps, German roads, German bridges. The work was continuous and repetitive and dangerous in ways that accumulated gradually rather than presenting itself as a single dramatic crisis. On July 25, 1944, Aanenson participated in Operation Cobra, the American breakout offensive south of St. Lo that would ultimately produce the Falaise disaster for German forces. Over 3,000 Allied aircraft participated in the operation, dropping thousands of tons of bombs on German defensive positions in a concentrated area. The bombardment was the heaviest airstrike of the entire campaign. It shattered German defenses and created the conditions for Patton's sweeping armored breakout. It also killed American soldiers. Some bombs fell short of their targets, striking American troops in forward positions. Aanenson and other pilots witnessed the aftermath of friendly fire casualties, men killed by the same weapons, the same aircraft, the same campaign they were part of. The moral complexity of that would stay with him. On August 3, 1944, Aanenson's war nearly ended over Vire, France. He was attacking German artillery positions when anti-aircraft fire struck his aircraft. Flak fragments punctured the engine and the fuel tanks. His cockpit caught fire. He tried to bail out. The canopy had been jammed by the battle damage. He was trapped in the burning cockpit. What he did next is almost impossible to describe as a rational decision, but it worked. Facing the certainty of burning to death in the next 30 seconds, he pushed his Thunderbolt into a steep dive, accelerating toward the ground at maximum speed. The rush of air through the damaged airframe, the same aerodynamic forces that made the P-47 so effective as a dive attack platform, extinguished the cockpit fire. He managed to control the badly damaged aircraft and crash land at his forward airfield. The impact was severe. He suffered a concussion, a dislocated shoulder, and burns to his hands and face. The Thunderbolt was wrecked beyond repair, broken in half from the crash landing. But Aanenson was alive. The aircraft's rugged construction, the same construction that German gunners found so frustrating to defeat, had made that survival possible. A less structurally sound aircraft would have come apart in the dive that extinguished the fire. The P-47's heavy airframe had held together long enough for the pilot to reach the ground. He recovered from his injuries and returned to flying combat missions. By the end of the war, in May 1945, Aanenson had flown 75 combat missions over France, Belgium, and Germany. He received the Distinguished Flying Cross for extraordinary achievement in aerial flight, the Air Medal with 9 oak leaf clusters for meritorious achievement, the Purple Heart for wounds received in action. His name did not appear in American newspapers during the war. He was one of thousands. Ground attack aviation is the least glamorous form of aerial warfare and, in many ways, the most psychologically demanding. High-altitude bomber crews flew at 25,000 feet above the battle, separated from the human reality of what their bomb loads did by 5 miles of vertical distance. Fighter pilots who engaged German aircraft in dogfights over France were fighting warriors, a mutual contest between trained men in equivalent machines, with a certain chivalric tradition reaching back to the First World War that, however romanticized, provided some psychological framework for processing the experience. Ground attack pilots had neither distance nor tradition. They flew at altitudes where they could see individual men on the roads below. They watched what happened when their machine gun struck a vehicle, watched it stop, watched the fire begin, watched men jump from the vehicle or fail to jump. They lined up on artillery positions and saw the gun crew scrambling, saw them die or run. They came back the next day and attacked similar positions on similar roads and watched similar things happen again. And then again the day after that. The German infantrymen and tank crews who experienced Jabo from the receiving end feared it as helplessness and death from above. The pilots delivering it experienced it as something harder to categorize, the systematic killing of enemy combatants at close enough range to see them as human beings, repeated dozens of times over months of operations. Aanenson later described the emotional and psychological impact with the kind of careful honesty that most veterans of his generation found very difficult. He struggled with nightmares and intrusive memories for years after the war ended. The images of men he had killed haunted him. He questioned whether the violence he had participated in was justified, and he understood intellectually that defeating Nazi Germany required exactly such actions, and that understanding provided cold comfort at 3 in the morning when the memories came. He struggled with survivor's guilt. His squadron had lost men throughout the campaign, pilots he had trained with in England, pilots he had known since Leuven or met since. He was alive and they were not, and the reasons for that were aerodynamic and mechanical and statistical rather than moral, which made them somehow harder to accept than if they had reflected something he had done or failed to do. After the war ended, Aanenson returned to Minnesota. He married Jacqueline Greer, the woman he had written letters to every single day from England and France, and worked in the insurance industry for 40 years. He rarely spoke about his combat experience. Like most veterans of his generation, he found it nearly impossible to explain what he had been through to people who hadn't been there. The vocabulary didn't translate. The emotional register was too distant from anything civilian life provided as a reference point. It was easier, most of the time, to remain silent. In the early 1990s, nearly 50 years after the war, Aanenson's adult children convinced him to document his story. They wanted to understand what their father had experienced. They wanted to preserve his testimony before it was lost. Aanenson agreed, and gathered his photographs, his wartime letters, all of them, everyone he had written to Jacqueline from England and France, and his memories, and created a video documentary titled A Fighter Pilot Story. The documentary combined Aanenson's personal photographs with archival footage from the National Archives. Aanenson provided narration in his own voice, reading from his wartime letters and describing his experiences with an honesty that was rare in wartime memoirs of any nationality. He talked about the men he had killed. He talked about the friends he had lost. He talked about what it had been like to fly into anti-aircraft fire knowing that the shells were aimed at him specifically, that the men below wanted him dead and were skilled at producing that outcome. The documentary aired on public television in 1994, the 50th anniversary of D-Day, and received wide attention for its emotional power and its refusal to simplify the experience of combat into heroism and victory. Unlike much wartime commemoration, a fighter pilot story showed the costs, the psychological damage, the moral complexity, the lasting trauma that many combat veterans carried for the rest of their lives without anyone around them knowing it was there. In 2007, documentary filmmaker Ken Burns featured Aanenson's story in his epic 7-part series, The War, which told the story of World War II through the experiences of ordinary Americans from 4 towns. Aanenson's testimony, about his combat experience, about his letters to Jacqueline, about his post-war struggles with memory and guilt, became one of the emotional centers of the series. Millions of Americans, most of whom had never heard of the 391st Fighter Squadron or the 366th Fighter Group, encountered his story and recognized in it something true about what the war had actually been. Quentin Aanenson died on March 5, 2008, at the age of 87. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. His documentary continued to be shown in schools, museums, and military training courses as an educational resource about the realities of aerial combat and the psychological costs of war. It still is. The official Army Air Force's statistical reports for the period from D-Day through V-Day credited P-47 pilots with extraordinary claims: 86,000 railroad cars destroyed, 9,000 locomotives knocked out, 6,000 armored fighting vehicles claimed, 68,000 trucks destroyed. Modern historians estimate that the actual destruction was perhaps 40 to 60% of the claimed totals. Gun camera footage and the chaos of low-altitude attacks frequently produced ambiguous evidence. Pilots attacking the same target often each claimed it as destroyed. Disabled vehicles were sometimes counted as destroyed when they might have been repairable. Reduce the numbers by half. The impact was still catastrophic. Thousands of vehicles actually destroyed. Hundreds of trains wrecked. German units throughout France reported severe shortages of fuel, ammunition, and supplies because Allied air attacks had systematically dismantled the transportation infrastructure. A Panzer division that ran out of fuel was not a Panzer division. It was a collection of very expensive static defensive positions. The operational effect went beyond the vehicles destroyed to the vehicles that were never moved. Every German unit in France allocated enormous resources, planning time, reconnaissance effort, fuel itself, to the problem of avoiding Allied air attack. Movements that would have taken hours in a permissive air environment took days. Units dedicated significant mental and physical energy to not being spotted from above rather than to fighting the enemy. The German army that had conquered most of Europe between 1939 and 1942 through speed, flexibility, and concentration of force was reduced to hiding in woods during daylight. The hunter had become the hunted. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief of German forces in the West and one of the Wehrmacht's most senior commanders, provided the most succinct assessment of the campaign in his post-war interrogations. When asked what factors had defeated German forces in France, he replied, "3 factors defeated us in the West. First, the unheard-of superiority of your air force, which made all movement in daytime impossible. Second, the lack of motor fuel. Third, the systematic destruction of all railway communications, so that it was impossible to bring one single railroad train across the Rhine. This made it impossible to bring up reserves, and it was foolish to attempt military operations in France under such conditions. Von Rundstedt was not the only senior German officer to reach this conclusion. Von Luck, in his memoir published in 1989, devoted considerable analysis to Allied air power's impact on German operations. He argued that the decisive factor in the Normandy campaign was not equipment quality, not the relative skill of soldiers, not even the numerical superiority of Allied forces. The decisive factor was air supremacy. Allied control of the air made it impossible for German forces to execute the mobile defensive operations that might have contained the invasion. German armor, which had demonstrated in 5 years of war that it was the most effective ground combat instrument in the world, was paralyzed. Not defeated in battle. Paralyzed from above. Von Luck survived the war, was captured by Soviet forces, and spent 5 years in Soviet captivity. He was released and returned to West Germany in 1950. In subsequent decades, he developed friendships with British officers he had fought against, participated in military history symposiums, and gave lectures at military colleges where he spoke honestly about German tactical mistakes, Hitler's catastrophic strategic decisions, and what modern militaries should learn from Normandy. He emphasized, repeatedly and consistently, that armor without air cover is not armor, it is a target. Hans von Luck died on August 1, 1997, at the age of 86. His memoir Panzer Commander remains in print and is still studied by military officers and historians as one of the most valuable first-hand accounts of German armored operations in the Second World War. Over 15,000 Republic P-47 Thunderbolts were built during the Second World War, more than any other American fighter aircraft. The aircraft served in every theater where American forces fought, from Western Europe to Italy to the Pacific. By the end of the war in Europe, the Thunderbolt had established a record of ground attack effectiveness that transformed how military planners thought about the relationship between air power and ground operations. That transformation is the true legacy of what happened over Normandy in the summer of 1944. Normandy provided something that theoretical debate could not, a definitive empirical test, conducted at scale, with comprehensive documentation, producing results clear enough to eliminate serious dispute about the fundamental conclusions. Ground forces operating without air superiority cannot sustain operations in modern warfare. This is not a subtle insight. It is a blunt, empirically verified fact, demonstrated at the cost of tens of thousands of lives in the fields and roads of Normandy. German forces had superior tanks in many relevant specifications. The Panther's long 75mm gun could destroy a Sherman at ranges where the Sherman could not effectively reply. The Tiger's armor was impenetrable to American tank guns at most combat ranges. German tank crews had more training and, in many cases, more combat experience than their American counterparts. None of it mattered when Thunderbolts were overhead. The tactical innovations that came out of Normandy, forward air controllers embedded with ground units, improved radio communication between air and ground forces, forward airfields established within days of an amphibious landing, became the foundation of close air support doctrine in every subsequent American military operation. Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Afghanistan, Iraq. The basic architecture of how American ground forces call in air support traces directly to what was improvised in Normandy in the summer of 1944. Von Luck and Aanenson, former enemies who never met during the war and almost certainly never met after it, contributed in their different ways to historical understanding of what air power over Normandy meant to those who experienced it. Von Luck provided the perspective from the ground, armor that could not move, infantry that could not concentrate, commanders who prayed for clouds and received death on clear days. Aanenson provided the perspective from above, the danger, the effectiveness, and the psychological cost of delivering that death day after day. Together, their testimonies describe a complete picture of what happens when one side achieves total dominance of the air above a battlefield. The side below loses. Not necessarily immediately. Von Luck's men held their positions on the Trun ridges and allowed 25,000 German soldiers to escape the Falaise pocket. They fought with genuine skill and courage under conditions that should have made organized resistance impossible. But without the ability to move, concentrate, supply, or reinforce, without the operational flexibility that modern armored warfare requires, German forces could delay but not prevent their own destruction. Rommel had said it 4 days into the campaign. There is simply no answer to it. He was right. The 3,000 sorties flown on August 8, 1944, and the destruction of Panzer Lehr Division in a single day, proved it with a finality that no subsequent argument has been able to challenge. A few surviving Thunderbolts can still be seen in museums and at air shows, massive radial engines turning those 13-foot propellers, the distinctive sound of the R-2800 filling the air with something that carries, to anyone who knows the history, a particular kind of authority. To German soldiers in Normandy in 1944, that sound meant something specific. It meant that clear weather had run out. It meant that the men in the vehicles on the roads below were targets, and that the machine descending toward them had 8 guns and no obligation to miss. Hans von Luck heard that sound from the ground, in a Panther tank, on the Tron ridges, in the worst week of the worst campaign of his life. Quentin Aanenson made that sound, from the cockpit of a Thunderbolt, over the burning roads of France, for 11 months. Between their 2 testimonies lies the complete truth of what happened in the sky above Normandy in the summer of 1944, the moment when air power stopped being an important supporting element of ground warfare and became the decisive factor, the condition that made everything else possible, and without which nothing else was enough.